But a white woman gave him a new life. An Apache warrior was left to die after losing his legs. The Apache warrior had always been a figure of strength and pride among his people. From a young age, he had learned the ways of the land, the whispers of the wind across the desert, the secrets hidden in the rocks and rivers, and the paths that allowed him to move through the terrain unseen. He had been raised with stories of courage, stories that spoke of ancestors who had faced impossible odds and had always found a way to survive. His own life, he believed, would be no different. He would fight, he would protect his family, and he would honor the traditions of his people. He was tall, with a lean, muscular frame shaped by years of running, hunting, and training. His skin bore the sun's dark warmth, and his eyes held a quiet intensity, the kind of focus that came from knowing the land as an extension of one's own body. Among his tribe, he was not just a warrior. He was someone who carried the hopes of his people. They knew they could rely on him in times of danger, and he never let them down. Life for the Apache was not easy. Their lands were constantly under threat, and they had to be ready at any moment to defend themselves against outsiders who did not understand or respect their way of life. But the warrior had accepted this reality as part of his existence. He had learned to live with the tension and uncertainty, to find beauty in the small moments, like the first rays of sunlight on the desert sand, or the quiet sound of water flowing in a hidden stream. These moments reminded him of why he fought, why he endured, and why he valued the people around him. One day, as he led a small group of warriors through the desert, they were ambushed by a group of armed men who had been lying in wait.
The fight was swift and brutal.
The warrior moved with precision, striking with the skill that had been honed through years of training, but even his courage could not shield him from the cruelty of fate. In the chaos, he was struck in both legs, leaving him helpless on the harsh ground. Pain surged through him unlike anything he had ever experienced, sharp and unrelenting. He tried to move, tried to call for help, but the world around him seemed to blur. Dust filled the air, the shouts of his fellow warriors echoed faintly, and then silence. Abandoned in the desert, the warrior faced a reality that he had never prepared for. The sun beat down on him mercilessly, and the nights grew cold and unforgiving. Each moment became a test of endurance. He remembered the stories of his ancestors, stories of survival and courage, and he drew on them for strength. But the body is a fragile thing, and his injuries made every breath, every movement a struggle. Hunger gnawed at him, and thirst pressed on his throat, but he refused to surrender. Somewhere deep inside, he clung to the hope that he might be found, that someone might come to help him, that he might survive despite everything. The days blurred into nights, and the nights into days. The warrior's mind drifted through memories, times of joy, laughter, and family. He remembered the faces of those he loved, the sound of their voices, and the warmth of their presence. These memories became his companions in the desolate landscape, small beacons of light in the dark. He thought of his tribe, wondering if they would mourn him, or if they would continue to fight, to live, as he had always taught them to do. As he lay in the desert, he observed the small details of life around him. A lizard skittering across the sand, a hawk circling above, the pattern of clouds in the sky. These simple things, which he had once taken for granted, became a source of comfort. They reminded him that the world continued even in the face of suffering. Even when he felt most alone, life carried on, and there was a strange beauty in that persistence. In the quiet of the desert, the warrior began to think about what it meant to be human. He had always measured himself by his strength and his courage, by his ability to protect others and face danger without fear. But now, stripped of his physical power, he realized that courage was not only an action but also an endurance, in the ability to continue when all seemed lost. He felt fear, pain, and doubt, but he also felt a stubborn will to live that refused to be broken. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, he heard a faint sound in the distance. At first he thought it was a trick of the wind, a cruel illusion played by his exhausted mind. But the sound grew clearer, footsteps, deliberate and soft. His heart leapt with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Could it be someone coming to help him? He strained to see through the dimming light, and then slowly a figure appeared on the horizon. It was a woman moving carefully toward him. Her presence was unexpected, almost surreal. She was not from his people, and at first he did not know whether to trust her. But as she approached, he could see kindness in her eyes, a gentleness that contrasted with the harshness of the desert and the violence he had endured. She knelt beside him without hesitation, speaking softly in a language that was foreign but soothing. Her hands worked quickly and skillfully, tending to his wounds, cleaning them with care, and wrapping them to stop the bleeding. The warrior felt something he had not experienced in a long time. Relief. Not just physical relief, but emotional relief. He was no longer entirely alone. Someone had seen him, recognized his suffering, and had chosen to help. Desert, once a place of isolation and despair, began to feel less hostile. For the first time since the attack, he allowed himself to hope. As night fell, she built a small fire and helped him rest. He could feel her determination and compassion, and it touched something deep within him. Though he could not move, he listened as she worked, told stories, and hummed quietly, creating a sense of safety in a world that had seemed utterly cruel. He realized that his survival was now intertwined with hers, not just through her care, but through the simple, profound act of being seen and valued. The first night passed slowly. The warrior drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes tormented by pain, other times comforted by the warmth of the fire and the presence of the woman. He could feel the desert around him, vast and silent, but it no longer seemed entirely empty. The world had opened a small door, a possibility that he had thought lost. By morning, the warrior understood that his life had changed forever. The woman's compassion had given him a chance to live, and with that chance came a responsibility. He could not simply succumb to despair. He had to find strength within himself, even in this new, weakened state. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, and his legs, once a symbol of his independence and power, were now gone. But in their absence, he discovered a different kind of strength, resilience, patience, and the courage to trust another human being. As the sun rose, painting the desert in bright, hopeful light, the warrior looked at the woman who had saved him. Her presence was quiet but commanding, filled with the kind of bravery that comes not from battle, but from choosing to care for someone when it is neither easy nor expected. He realized that life, even in its harshest form, could hold unexpected kindness, and that even a warrior could be rescued by the simple, profound act of empathy. From that day, the Apache warrior began a journey unlike any he had imagined, one not defined by the strength of his body, but by the depth of human connection, compassion, and hope. And in the quiet desert where life had once seemed impossible, a new chapter began, written not with weapons or conquest, but with care, patience, and the courage to keep living against all odds. After the first night, the Apache warrior's world had changed in ways he could not yet fully understand. His body, once strong and reliable, was now fragile and weak. His legs were gone, leaving him completely dependent on the woman who had found him in the desert. Each day was a struggle, each movement a painful reminder of what he had lost. Yet despite his suffering, there was a flicker of hope, and that hope began to grow. The woman, whose name he would come to know as Elizabeth, was patient and persistent. She had a quiet strength, the kind that did not shout or demand, but instead worked steadily, even when the odds seemed impossible. She built a small shelter from the desert brush to protect him from the scorching sun and the biting wind at night. She fetched water from a nearby stream, carefully carrying it back to him so he could drink and bathe his wounds. She spoke gently, offering words of encouragement and sometimes singing soft, soothing melodies that seemed to carry away some of the warrior's pain. The first few days were the hardest. Every small movement was agony. Even sitting up caused searing pain, and the warrior often wondered if he would ever feel strength in his body again. Hunger gnawed at him constantly. Elizabeth tried to find food that he could eat, small amounts at a time, but his appetite was weak, and he had lost much weight. He felt helpless, frustrated, and embarrassed. Pride, which had always been central to his identity, now felt like a distant memory. To accept help from someone else went against everything he had been taught. Yet he could not deny that, without Elizabeth, he would not have survived. As the days passed, the warrior began to observe Elizabeth more closely. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. She moved with confidence, yet without arrogance. Her hands were skilled, not from fighting, but from years of practical work, tending to plants, preparing food, and building a safe place to live. She did not judge him, even when he grew frustrated or angry. She did not pity him, even when his body was weak and his spirit faltered. There was a quiet dignity in her actions that touched him deeply. The desert around them was both beautiful and merciless. The sun rose each morning in blazing gold, casting long shadows across the sand. By noon, the heat became almost unbearable, and the warrior felt every moment of it pressing down on him. At night, the temperature would drop sharply, and he shivered under the thin blankets Elizabeth provided. But even in the harshness of the desert, there were small wonders that reminded him of life's persistence. He watched birds swoop and dive in the sky, small animals scurry across the sand and the flowers that bloomed unexpectedly after a rare desert rain. These small glimpses of life brought him a quiet comfort and reminded him that survival was still possible. Elizabeth encouraged him to move, slowly, with great care. She taught him to shift his weight, to use his arms and hands in ways he had never considered, and to rely on his mind as much as his body. At first it was exhausting and painful, and he often wanted to give up, but she never forced him. She simply showed him the way, step by step, praising even the smallest progress. Over time, he began to feel a tiny spark of independence returning. Each small movement, each small success, was a victory. It reminded him that even though his life had changed forever, he was not entirely powerless. Despite the slow progress, the warrior faced other dangers as well. The desert was not empty. Snakes, scorpions, and wild animals roamed the sands, and he had to trust Elizabeth to keep him safe. There were storms that blew sand into their shelter, sometimes forcing them to take shelter in the open, where the wind cut at their skin. Hunger and thirst were constant companions, and he had to learn patience, waiting for Elizabeth to bring food and water instead of seeking it himself as he once would have. Each challenge tested his endurance, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. Loneliness, too, became a battle. Though Elizabeth was present, he missed the connection with his tribe, the faces of his family, the laughter and voices he had taken for granted. The desert was vast, and the world beyond it seemed impossibly distant. Memories of home both comforted and haunted him. He recalled the sound of drums in celebration, the smell of food cooked over an open fire, and the stories told by elders by the flickering light of flames. Those memories were bittersweet. They reminded him of what he had lost, but also of what he could strive to protect in spirit, even if he could no longer return. As the days turned into weeks, the warrior began to trust Elizabeth more. Trust was not something he gave lightly. In his life as a warrior, suspicion and caution had kept him alive. But Elizabeth's actions were consistent. She never abandoned him, never grew impatient, never made him feel like a burden. Boo. Slowly he allowed himself to speak to her, to share fragments of his past, his family, and his life before the injuries. He spoke of battles he had fought, the lessons he had learned, and the principles he had always tried to live by. She listened without judgment, offering understanding and empathy in return. In turn, Elizabeth shared stories of her own life. She spoke of the places she had traveled, the people she had met, and the challenges she had faced. She did not try to make his suffering seem small. Instead, she spoke in a way that acknowledged hardship while emphasizing resilience. Through these exchanges, a bond grew between them. It was not the bond of equals in power, but of mutual respect and human connection. The warrior began to see that strength was not only in the body, but also in compassion, patience, and the ability to face life's challenges with courage of spirit. One day, a particularly harsh storm struck the desert. The wind howled, whipping sand through the air and threatening the fragile shelter they had built. The warrior felt fear, a fear he had not known since his youth. But Elizabeth remained calm. She moved with purpose, adjusting the shelter, securing their supplies, and keeping him safe. Her calmness in the face of danger became a lesson in itself. He realized that courage could take many forms, and sometimes it was the quiet, steady actions that mattered most. That night, as the storm raged outside, he felt a growing admiration for her, not just as a caretaker, but as a person who faced challenges with grace and determination. As time passed, the warrior's body began to adjust, though he would never walk again. He learned to navigate the desert using his hands and upper body, using tools Elizabeth helped him craft, and finding ways to move without relying on legs. Each success was a small triumph, a proof that life could continue even after profound loss. And each time he overcame a difficulty, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Survival was no longer just a matter of enduring pain. It became a journey of discovery, of learning new ways to live and find meaning. Through all this, the warrior's heart and mind began to change. He had been forced to confront vulnerability in a way he had never experienced. His identity as a warrior had been tied to physical strength, skill, and independence. Now, he realized that resilience, trust, and the ability to adapt were equally important. He began to see life not as a series of battles to be fought, but as a journey in which kindness, patience, and understanding were just as valuable as courage and skill. By the end of the second month, the warrior and Elizabeth had settled into a rhythm. He still faced immense challenges, but he no longer faced them alone. Their bond had grown into something profound, a connection born of shared struggle, trust, and mutual respect. The desert, which had once seemed like a place of death and despair, now held possibility. It was still harsh and unforgiving, but within it, life could continue and even thrive when met with patience, courage, and care. The warrior came to understand that this journey was about more than survival. It was about learning to accept help, to trust and to see strength in new forms. Elizabeth had not only saved his life, but had also opened a door to a different kind of existence, one in which human connection could be as powerful as any weapon, and compassion could be as vital as any skill he had learned as a warrior. In the quiet moments, as the sun set and the desert glowed in shades of gold and pink, he reflected on how far he had come. He thought about the nights filled with fear and pain, the slow days of healing and the small victories that had marked his progress. He realized that even in the face of great loss, life could still offer moments of beauty and hope. And he knew that, thanks to Elizabeth, he had a chance to continue his journey, not as the warrior he once was, but as someone stronger in ways he had never imagined. The desert had tested him, stripped him of what he had taken for granted, and left him vulnerable. Yet, through this hardship, he discovered resilience, the power of human connection, and the courage to face life again. He no longer measured his worth by the strength of his legs, but by the depth of his spirit and the bonds he could form. Each day was a step forward, and each step was a victory. Testum weeks turned into months, and the Apache warrior's body slowly adapted to life without his legs. He had learned to move using his hands and arms, to balance himself and to navigate the desert terrain in ways he never thought possible. Each day was still a struggle, but his confidence began to grow. He realized that while he could no longer run or fight as he once had, he could still survive and even find purpose in this new life. Yet, even with his physical skills improving, there remained a gap in his spirit, a feeling of incompleteness that he could not quite name. Elizabeth had become a constant presence in his life. She was not only his caretaker but also his teacher and guide. Her patience was endless, and her compassion seemed to know no bounds. She helped him build tools to assist his movements, crafted a small cart that allowed him to carry water and supplies, and showed him ways to forage and hunt from a seated position. Every day he learned something new. Every day he discovered a strength within himself that had nothing to do with his legs. Slowly, he began to feel capable again. It was during one of these quiet days, as the sun cast a warm glow over the desert, that Elizabeth suggested they try something new. "There is a place nearby," she said softly, "where the land is greener, where water flows more freely. It is not far, and I think you could get there with some help. I want you to see it." The warrior hesitated. The idea of traveling was frightening. The desert had already tested him beyond measure, and every step, every movement, required effort and courage. He was still learning to trust his own body, and the thought of going farther than he already had seemed almost impossible. But Elizabeth's eyes held a quiet determination, the same gentle strength that had carried him through his darkest hours. There was no pressure in her voice, only encouragement, and somehow that was enough to make him consider it. Over the next several days, they prepared for the journey. Elizabeth carefully packed supplies, water, food, blankets, and basic tools, while teaching the warrior how to manage the cart and move safely across uneven terrain. She showed him how to read the subtle signs of the desert, where to find shade, how to avoid dangerous plants or animals, and how to pace himself so that exhaustion would not overtake him. The warrior absorbed everything she said, amazed at her knowledge and at her ability to remain calm and organized even in the harsh desert environment. Finally, the day came. The warrior sat on the cart, gripping the handles tightly as Elizabeth pushed from behind. Each movement was slow, deliberate, and exhausting. His arms ached, and the effort reminded him of how much he had lost. Yet with each mile they traveled, he felt a small surge of pride and determination. He was moving, he was surviving, and he was learning to live in a way he had never imagined. Along the journey, they encountered challenges that tested them both. A sudden sandstorm whipped across the land, forcing them to take shelter behind a small cluster of rocks. For hours they waited, listening to the wind scream and the sand sting their faces. The warrior felt fear, frustration, and the temptation to give up. But Elizabeth stayed calm. She covered him as best she could, spoke in soothing tones, and reminded him that storms, like hardship, would pass. When the sandstorm finally subsided, they continued their journey, both a little tired but stronger in spirit. As they neared the greener area Elizabeth had promised, the warrior began to see life in a way he had not for many months. Small shrubs grew beside the stream, birds chirped above, and the sound of water moving over rocks filled him with a sense of peace. It was a stark contrast to the barren desert they had left behind. For the first time since his injuries, he felt something close to joy. The simple beauty of the landscape reminded him that life, even after suffering, could hold wonder. Elizabeth helped him off the cart, guiding him to the edge of the water. The warrior hesitated at first, unsure how to balance himself on the uneven ground. But with her support, he leaned forward, letting his hands touch the cool, flowing water. The sensation was unlike anything he had felt in months. The cold, refreshing water ran over his hands, and For a moment he allowed himself to simply exist, to feel, to breathe, and to appreciate. He had survived the desert, survived his injuries, and now he could feel a small taste of freedom again. It was in this moment, by the water, that something deeper began to shift. The warrior realized that Elizabeth's presence in his life was more than just help or survival. She had become his companion, someone who had seen him at his weakest and chosen to stay. The trust between them had grown into something profound. He felt a gratitude so deep it brought tears to his eyes, and he realized that human connection could be as essential to survival as food, water, or shelter. The days that followed were filled with new discoveries. Elizabeth showed him how to gather edible plants, catch fish from the stream, and use natural resources to make simple tools. Each lesson was small, but each was a step toward independence. The warrior found that his mind, once focused solely on survival and battle, could now learn, adapt, and create in new ways. He began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a man fighting to live. He was someone who could continue to grow, learn, and contribute, even with his injuries. Yet, despite these small triumphs, the warrior still faced moments of despair. His body reminded him constantly of what he had lost. There were nights when the pain seemed unbearable, when frustration and loneliness weighed heavily on his heart. In those moments, Elizabeth's presence was a lifeline. She listened patiently, offered comfort, and reminded him that progress often came slowly and that strength was not only in the body but in the mind and spirit. Her unwavering support allowed him to face each challenge, to push past despair, and to keep moving forward. One afternoon, as they rested by the stream, the warrior spoke for the first time about his fears for the future. He admitted that he worried he would never find a purpose again, that his life might be empty now, that he could no longer fight or travel as he once had. Elizabeth listened without interrupting, her eyes calm and steady. Then she said something he would remember forever. Purpose is not always about what you can do with your body. Sometimes purpose is found in how you touch the lives of others, in the care you give, and the courage you show when life is hardest. Her words struck him deeply. He realized that his journey was no longer about proving strength or skill, but about resilience, empathy, and the ability to endure hardship with dignity. The warrior began to understand that his injuries, while tragic, had also opened a path to a new kind of life, one where compassion, learning, and human connection mattered as much as any physical ability. Over time, the warrior and Elizabeth formed a routine. They traveled together to gather resources, built simple shelters for protection, and learned to live in harmony with the land around them. The warrior's skills as a hunter and tracker were adapted to his new condition, and he discovered clever ways to use his hands and mind to overcome obstacles. Each day brought small victories, and with each victory came a renewed sense of confidence and hope. The bond between them deepened. The warrior came to trust Elizabeth not just for survival, but as a true companion. He shared stories of his past, his family, his tribe, and the life he had led before the injuries. In return, Elizabeth shared her own experiences, creating a connection that went beyond language, culture, or circumstance. They learned from each other, supported each other, and slowly healed together. Through these months, the warrior also began to reflect on the nature of life and strength. He realized that courage was not only in facing physical danger, but also in enduring pain, trusting others, and adapting to change. He began to see life as a journey with many forms of victory, some quiet and internal, others shared with those who cared for him. This understanding became the foundation of a new identity, one that combined his past as a warrior with the lessons of resilience, patience, and connection he had learned from Elizabeth. The turning point in his journey was not a dramatic battle or heroic feat, but a quiet, profound realization. He was not alone, and life could still hold meaning, purpose, and beauty. The warrior understood that survival was more than existing. It was learning, growing, and building bonds that could sustain him through any hardship. Elizabeth had shown him that even after unimaginable loss, a new life was possible, one defined not by what he had lost, but by what he could still achieve and share. By the time the desert began to bloom with the rare signs of spring, the warrior felt a sense of peace he had not known in months. He had faced despair, endured physical suffering, and confronted the fragility of life. Yet through it all, he had discovered a new strength, a new hope, and a new connection with another human being. His journey had reached a turning point, not because he had regained his legs, but because he had regained something even more profound, a sense of purpose, trust, and the knowledge that life, even after tragedy, could still be meaningful. The months of survival and slow recovery had changed the Apache warrior in ways he could not have imagined. He had grown stronger in mind, if not in body, and had learned to adapt to a life that once seemed impossible. But life had one final test for him, a challenge that would push him not only physically but emotionally to the very edge of despair, and ultimately show him the depth of his resilience and humanity. It began one early morning when the desert seemed particularly harsh. The wind carried dust that stung his face, and the heat pressed down with unusual intensity. The warrior was moving along the path they had traveled countless times, pushing his makeshift cart with supplies for the day. Elizabeth was close behind, steady and careful as always, but the desert had a way of hiding danger, and on this day, that danger came in the form of an unexpected storm. The sky darkened quickly, clouds rolling in with frightening speed. The wind picked up, carrying sand and grit that cut at the warrior's arms and face. It was not like any storm he had encountered before. It roared through the landscape, shaking the fragile shelter they had left behind and threatening to overturn the cart he relied upon for movement. The warrior felt fear like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. He gritted his teeth and held on, but the force of the wind made even the smallest movement an exhausting effort. Elizabeth stayed close, shouting over the roar of the storm to guide him, to remind him where to place his hands, to keep the cart balanced. Her calmness was remarkable, a steady light in the chaos. The warrior realized that she had become more than a caretaker. She had become a true partner in survival, but in that moment he felt the raw reality of his vulnerability. If Elizabeth were to falter even for a moment, he would be lost. Hours passed as they slowly made their way through the storm. The sand tore at their skin, their eyes stung, and their muscles screamed from the effort of pushing, pulling, and steadying the cart. The warrior's pride, once a cornerstone of his identity, threatened to betray him. He wanted to give up, to scream in frustration, to collapse and let the desert have him. Yet, each time he thought he could go no further, Elizabeth's steady presence reminded him of what he had survived to reach this point. Her determination became his anchor, her patience a shield against despair. When the storm finally began to subside, the warrior and Elizabeth were exhausted. Their clothes were torn, their skin raw from sand and sun, and yet they had made it. It pushed them to the limit and forced them to confront the fragility of life in a way they had not before. The warrior realized that survival was no longer about physical endurance alone. It was about trust, courage, and the ability to face fear without giving in. He looked at Elizabeth and felt a profound gratitude, not just for saving his life months earlier, but for showing him how to endure, how to face hardship, and how to find strength in companionship. That evening, as they rested by a small oasis, the warrior allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about the months that had passed since Elizabeth had found him in the desert. He remembered the first days of pain and helplessness, the long nights of fear, and the slow, painstaking process of learning to survive again. He thought of the small victories that had built his confidence and the lessons he had learned about patience, trust, and resilience. Most of all, he thought of Elizabeth not just as a helper, but as someone who had fundamentally changed his understanding of life. The warrior began to speak more openly to Elizabeth. He shared stories of his childhood, of his family, of the battles he had fought, and the lessons he had learned as a young man among his people. He spoke of pride and shame, of courage and fear, and of the deep loneliness that had haunted him in the desert. Elizabeth listened without judgment, responding with empathy and understanding. Through these conversations, the warrior realized that true strength was not in hiding one's fears or pain, but in confronting them, sharing them, and finding support in others. One night, as they sat by the fire, a moment arrived that tested the warrior in a different way. The desert night was quiet, the stars brilliant above, and a sense of calm had settled over the land. But inside, the warrior wrestled with a fear he had not fully acknowledged, the fear that even with survival and adaptation, he could never reclaim a sense of purpose. He had survived the desert, adapted to life without his legs, and built a bond with Elizabeth, but he still questioned what his life could mean now. Elizabeth noticed his silence and asked gently, "What troubles you?" The warrior hesitated. It was not easy for him to speak of doubt or vulnerability, yet something about her presence made him feel safe. "I wonder," he said slowly, "if my life will ever matter again. If I can ever do anything worthy now, after all I have lost." Elizabeth reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Life is not measured only by what you can do with your body," she said softly. "It is measured by what you can endure, by the courage you show when things are hardest, and by the love and care you give to others. You have already done more than you know." Her words struck a chord deep within him. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel not only fear and sorrow, but also hope. He realized that life could still hold meaning, even in a form he had never imagined. He could contribute, protect, and touch lives in ways that did not rely on physical strength alone. The warrior began to see that his purpose had shifted. from fighting battles with his body to facing life with courage, wisdom, and compassion. The days that followed brought more challenges, each testing his resolve. They encountered a small group of travelers who had become lost in the desert. The warrior, using his knowledge of the land and the lessons Elizabeth had taught him, helped guide them to safety. Though his body could not move as it once had, his mind, experience, and resilience allowed him to lead others through danger. He discovered a new form of power, the ability to influence, guide, and protect without relying on physical strength. This experience became a turning point. The warrior realized that he could make a difference, even in his new condition. He understood that courage was not measured in battles won with weapons, but in facing fear, enduring hardship, and helping others despite one's own pain. He began to embrace his new life fully, finding pride and purpose in ways he had never anticipated. Elizabeth watched him grow with quiet satisfaction. She had saved his life, but she also nurtured his spirit, helping him discover strengths that he had overlooked. Their bond deepened, no longer defined solely by caretaker and patient, but by trust, respect, and shared experience. The warrior had come to see her not just as a companion, but as a symbol of hope, resilience, and the unexpected kindness that could exist even in a harsh world. One evening, as they rested by the stream, the warrior reflected on the months of struggle and transformation. He had faced storms, hunger, pain, and despair, yet he had emerged stronger in spirit. He understood that life, even after profound loss, could still hold beauty, purpose, and connection. The warrior realized that true strength was not in what one could physically do, but in the courage to face life fully, to endure, and to build bonds that sustain both body and soul. By the time the desert began to bloom with the first signs of spring, the warrior felt a sense of completeness he had never known before. The storm had passed, both literally and metaphorically, and he could see clearly the path forward. He had survived, adapted, and discovered a new purpose. The warrior was no longer defined by the loss of his legs, but by the resilience of his spirit, the depth of his compassion, and the bond he had forged with Elizabeth. The climax of his journey was not a dramatic battle or heroic feat, but a quiet, profound realization. He could live fully, meaningfully, and with dignity, even in a life transformed by loss. He understood that his survival was not just a matter of endurance, but of hope, trust, and the willingness to embrace a new reality. And in that understanding, he found peace, pride, and a sense of triumph that surpassed any physical victory he had ever known. From that moment on, the warrior's life was no longer measured by what he had lost, but by what he could create, nurture, and share. The desert, which had once seemed a place of despair, now held opportunity. Every day became a chance to learn, grow, and connect. He had faced his deepest fears, endured the harshest trials, and discovered the strength of the human spirit in ways he had never imagined. The warrior had reached the peak of his transformation. The pain, fear, and despair of the past months had shaped him, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they became the foundation for a life rebuilt on resilience, trust, compassion, and purpose. And through it all, Elizabeth remained by his side, a reminder that even in the darkest deserts, light could be found and new life could begin.